Everyone, I need to share something about my daughter that you all should know before we toast tonight. That was the moment my father's voice sliced through the air like a cold knife. The clinking of glasses and the warm bubble of laughter around the lavish banquet table instantly died. You could feel the tension crawl up the silk drape walls of that fancy hotel restaurant, a physical, chilling presence that replaced the air. Every eye swiveled from him to me, and the weight of their collective gaze felt heavier than the starched white linen on the table. I'm Leela, I'm 29 years old, and in that suspended second, I wished with every fiber of my being that the ornate carpet beneath my feet would just open up and swallow me whole. The room was a gallery of my father's life, packed with his sharp-suited business partners, calculating former board members, and dutifully admiring family friends. There were glittering chandeliers refracting light off crystal glasses, bottles of wine that cost more than our weekly groceries, and frankly, more ego in the room than oxygen. It was his world, his victory lap, and we were all just extras in the scene. When he had invited me and Ethan, I had actually thought, naively, foolishly, that maybe this time would be different. Perhaps the sentimentality of retirement would soften him. Maybe, after all these years, he'd look at me, his daughter, who had built a small but thriving graphic design studio from nothing, and finally say he was proud. Maybe he'd stop comparing me to my brother, Daniel, the golden child investment banker, who seemed to print money and accolades just by breathing the rarefied air of high finance. But no, my father, Richard Cole, master of the subtle power play, had other plans entirely. As everyone turned toward him, a practiced, expectant smile on their faces, I felt my husband, Ethan, squeeze my hand under the table. His touch was my only anchor, warm, solid, and calm amidst the sudden storm of my anxiety. I could feel my own pulse, a frantic, wild drumming against his steady palm. Ethan, with his honest eyes and kind soul, worked as a delivery driver for a logistics company. To my father, he was invisible. A man who didn't wear a suit or drive a German luxury car was simply background noise in the symphony of his own success. My father raised his glass, the crystal catching the light, and smiled that particular polished smile of his, the one people use right before they say something cruel and pretend it's just a bit of playful jest for the room. "My daughter Leela," he began, his voice dripping with a paternalistic warmth that didn't reach his eyes, "has always taken, let's say, an unconventional path." The room offered a soft, nervous clucker, a ripple of uncertainty. They were testing the waters, waiting to see which way the current of his judgment would flow before they decided to swim with it. While her brother was managing multi-million-dollar investment portfolios, Leela was rescuing stray dogs. The words hung in the air, coated in a veneer of paternal bemusement. A few people around the table offered tight, polite smiles, their eyes darting between my father and me, unsure whether to endorse the mockery. My face burned, a hot flush of humiliation creeping up my neck. He made my compassion, the very core of who I was, sound like a quaint hobby, a childish distraction from the real work of life. "I suppose the world needs people like her too," he continued with a magnanimous shrug, as if granting me a small, inconsequential space in his grand universe. "Not everyone can chase big dreams." He took a deliberate sip of his prize Bordeaux, the dark red liquid seeming to swallow the light. The way he looked at me over the rim of his glass, so smug, so condescending, was the look I had known my entire life. It was the same expression he had when I showed him my art in third grade, when I chose a state college over an Ivy League, when I introduced him to Ethan. It was a look that never changed, a constant, silent verdict: you will never, ever measure up. Ethan's hand was still holding mine under the table, a warm, firm pressure. He didn't flinch, didn't frown in anger. His stillness was a fortress against my father's storm, a calm, steady, patient presence that silently communicated everything I needed to know. "I see you. I am here. You are enough." But my father wasn't finished. He was just warming up, clearly relishing the captive audience. "And then she married a delivery driver." He paused, letting the title land in the room with its intended thud. "A fine young man, I'm sure," he added, his voice laced with a thin, disingenuous smile that never touched his cold eyes. It's sweet, really, very down to earth. The table went utterly quiet again, the silence now thick and uncomfortable. My brother, Daniel, studied the intricate pattern on his porcelain plate with sudden intense fascination, unable to meet my gaze. Across the table, my mother offered me that pitying look she had perfected over the years, a mixture of sadness and helpless resignation that somehow felt even worse than the open contempt. I wanted the floor to open up. I wanted the glittering chandelier above to flicker and die. I wanted to be anywhere but in that chair, under the weight of that collective judgment. Dad kept going, his voice booming with false joviality, clearly enjoying the control he wielded over the room's atmosphere. But let's be honest, he said, chuckling as if sharing an inside joke with his esteemed guests. A man in his position, Ethan probably knows more about traffic routes and backstreet shortcuts than he does about tax brackets or asset portfolios, right? The forced, sycophantic laughter from my father's drunk partners echoed in my ears, a harsh soundtrack to my humiliation. My throat tightened into a knot, and I could feel the hot, unwelcome sting of tears pressing behind my eyes. I bit the inside of my cheek, the sharp, metallic taste of blood grounding me, a private pain to counter the public spectacle. Through it all, Ethan was an island of serenity. He didn't react with anger or shame. He simply smiled a small, polite smile, took a slow, deliberate sip of water, and met my father's gaze. "You're right, sir," he said, his voice even and clear. "I do spend a lot of time on the road. You learn a lot about people that way. Their habits, their schedules, their secrets." Something in his tone, a thread of unshakable calm, made me pause. He wasn't squirming under the pressure. He was observing, analyzing, like a chess player who had already seen several moves ahead. The confusion momentarily overshadowed my hurt. Then came the real, soul-crushing humiliation. My father, reveling in his dominance, tapped his fork against his crystal glass again, the sharp ping silencing the murmurs. My blood ran cold. I froze in my seat, a statue of dread. He turned his gaze directly toward me, that same infuriatingly smug grin plastered on his face. "After careful consideration," he began, as if discussing a corporate merger, "I've decided to revise my estate plan. Since Leela's lifestyle choices," he said the words like they were a contagious disease, "don't exactly reflect financial prudence or the family's legacy, I'll be leaving my company's shares and the controlling stake in coal holdings entirely to Daniel." A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the room. He actually said it. He had publicly disowned me, not for any crime, but for the sin of not being rich enough, for marrying a man he deemed unworthy. I felt my stomach drop through the floor. The man who was supposed to protect and support me had just declared me a financial liability in front of the entire world that mattered to him. I opened my mouth, a weak protest forming on my lips, but no sound emerged. I was utterly, completely shattered. Ethan's expression, however, didn't change. He didn't look shocked or outraged. He simply reached for his phone, unlocked it with a quiet tap, and typed something quickly, his movements efficient and purposeful. Then he placed the device face down beside his plate, a silent, mysterious act. My father, oblivious, raised his glass high. "To Daniel, to family success, and to the next generation of leadership." Everyone reluctantly raised their glasses, the clink sounding hollow and forced. Ethan didn't. He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The room fell into a dead silence. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade, "before we toast, I think there's something your guests should know, Mr. Cole." The entire table swiveled their heads toward him, a sea of stunned faces. My father smirked, condescension dripping from his expression. "Oh, and what would that be, Ethan? You have a funny story about one of your deliveries?" he mocked. Ethan smiled a faint, knowing smile. "Not exactly. I have a story about you." My father let out a loud, dismissive laugh, shaking his head in amusement. "Oh, this should be good. Please, by all means, enlighten us." He gestured widely, giving Ethan the floor he was so sure would be his stage for further humiliation. The polished oak doors of the hotel restaurant swung shut behind us, muffling the chaotic din that had erupted inside. The cool night air hit my face, a shocking, clean contrast to the stifling atmosphere we had just escaped. It felt like my first real breath in years. Ethan's hand, still resting gently on the small of my back, was a steady, warm presence guiding me forward. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city hummed around us, indifferent to the personal earthquake that had just reshaped our world. I stopped on the sidewalk, turning to look at him under the glow of a street lamp. The man I had married, the man I thought delivered packages, now stood before me as a federal agent. The quiet, observant man I loved was still there, but now I saw the hidden layers of strength and purpose that had been concealed beneath the surface. "You really never stop surprising me, do you?" I finally said, my voice a mixture of awe and residual shock. He gave a small, wry smile, the same one I'd fallen in love with, but now it held a new depth. "I told you I was good at keeping secrets." I laughed bubble up from my chest, watery and raw, mingling with the tears of relief still streaking my cheeks. "I could have told you weren't actually a delivery driver," I whispered, swatting his arm playfully. He caught my hand, his expression turning earnest. "I wanted you to love me for who I am," he said softly, his thumb stroking my knuckles. "Not for a title, not for a badge, just for Ethan." And that's when the full, staggering truth of the night settled over me. My father had spent his entire life building a fortress of status and wealth, judging everyone by their position in his hierarchy, and the man he had deemed beneath him, the delivery driver, had possessed more integrity, power, and quiet strength than anyone in that gilded room. The very values my father mocked, kindness, humility, authenticity, were the ones that had ultimately held the real power. As we drove away, the city lights streaking past the car window like fallen stars, I finally exhaled. It was a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release all the years of hurt, the constant pressure to measure up, the weight of his conditional love. I watched his glittering skyline of his world recede in the rearview mirror. Because that night, I didn't just watch my father's empire of ego crumble. I watched myself rise from its ashes. The little girl who had always felt less than was finally, irrevocably free. So if your family ever makes you feel small, if they use their approval as a weapon, remember this: your worth is not a stock in their portfolio. It is not defined by their balance sheets or their condescending smiles. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't a confrontation. It's the profound, unshakable peace of walking away and building a life on your own terms. Has anyone ever made you feel like you'd never be enough? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. And if you believe that character matters more than currency and that kindness is a greater legacy than a corporation, hit subscribe. Because true respect is earned by who you are, not by what you own. And tonight, I learned that lesson from the most unexpected teacher of all.